Auschwitz, revealing the worst atrocities ever told. Between May and June 1944, the Nazis captured on film the ruthless system at Auschwitz II Birkenau. Mass selections on the ramps, endless lines of people on the way to death, and the victims' personal belongings reduced to mere belongings sorted by their executioners. In less than 5 years, the 3 Auschwitz camps became an epicenter of barbarism. More than 1.1 million people, including 200,000 children, lost their lives there. Women were forced to undergo abortions, while children were separated from their families, sent to labor camps or directly to the gas chambers. Living conditions were inhumane: overcrowded, rat-infested barracks, constant hunger and forced labor until collapse. Every day involved the physical and psychological torture of witnessing the death of loved ones. Although the Third Reich established nearly 1,000 concentration camps, none matched the level of brutality and death at Auschwitz. Auschwitz, the death camp of the Aryan race. On 27 April 1940, SS Commander Heinrich Himmler gave the order to establish a concentration camp in the town of Auschwitz in southern Poland. This order was the starting point for the creation of Auschwitz. At that time, Auschwitz was a small, quiet town located about 50 kilometers southwest of Krakow. But with Himmler's order, everything changed. The site was selected to house a concentration camp and soon became a site of death. The Auschwitz camp was designed to hold thousands of prisoners, and its construction was carried out quickly. The site was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, and brick barracks were built to house the prisoners. In early 1941, the Auschwitz camp began to receive prisoners. By March of that year, there were already 10,900 people imprisoned in the camp, most of them of Polish nationality. But this number soon became only a fraction of the total number of people who would be sent to Auschwitz. Of the 1.3 million people who were sent to Auschwitz, 1.1 million died in the camp. Among the victims were 960,000 Jews, 865,000 of whom were gassed upon arrival at the camp. There were also 74,000 non-Jewish Poles, 21,000 Roma Gypsies, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and up to 15,000 people from other groups, including communist militants, partisans, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and mentally ill patients. Prisoners at Auschwitz were subjected to inhumane conditions, including starvation, exhaustion, disease, and individual executions. Many of them died due to lack of food, physical exhaustion, and diseases that spread rapidly in the camp. Others were killed during medical experiments, a practice that became one of the darkest features of the Nazi regime. In the winter of 1941, as the final solution was underway, the Nazi regime needed to find a way to exterminate more Jews more efficiently. It was then decided to build a new concentration camp, about 3 kilometers from the existing one, on a marshy terrain known to the Poles as Brzezinka and to the Germans as Birkenau. Although Auschwitz-Birkenau would eventually become the site of the largest mass murder of Jews in history, its construction was not originally planned for that purpose. In fact, Birkenau was intended to be a prisoner of war camp at a time when Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's attempt to invade the Soviet Union, was underway. The task of designing and building the new camp fell to SS Captain Karl Bischoff, who had recently been appointed head of the Auschwitz Construction Office, and architect SS Corporal Fritz Ertl. However, from the beginning, it was clear that the plan they had devised was not suitable for sustaining human life. Their initial plan was for one barrack block to hold 550 prisoners, which meant that the prisoners would be packed together in inhumane conditions. By comparison, at the Dachau concentration camp, a similar block could only hold 200 prisoners. This meant that prisoners at Auschwitz-Birkenau would be exposed to extreme overcrowding and suffering. Construction of the second Auschwitz camp, Birkenau, began in 1941. At that time, SS officers forced the inmates themselves to build the camp, using 10,000 Soviet prisoners who began work in the autumn of that year. However, only a few hundred of them survived until the following spring, due to the inhumane conditions in which they were forced to work. Prisoners worked day and night without stopping, under the strict supervision of SS personnel, in an unhealthy environment prone to the spread of disease. The swamps surrounding Auschwitz were a particularly dangerous place, and disease spread rapidly among the inmates. Despite the terrible conditions, the prisoners managed to finish the construction of Birkenau, which would become the main extermination center for Jews in the Third Reich. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, was so pleased with the result that he allowed another camp to be built nearby for slaves working at the IG Farben factory. The construction of these camps turned Auschwitz-Birkenau into an impressive and deadly complex of buildings which played a crucial role in the murderous machinery of the Third Reich. Although the orders came directly from Heinrich Himmler, the daily operation and most of the innovations that made Auschwitz different from the rest of the extermination camps came from the mind of a single monstrous man. This individual was in charge of implementing the final solution in its most lethal and systematic form, transforming Auschwitz into the most sinister and effective place of the Nazi extermination apparatus. The name of this man, whose legacy is marked by the suffering and death of millions, is Rudolf Höss. Rudolf Höss, from Dachau to Auschwitz. In April 1940, an SS officer named Rudolf Höss arrived in a small town in southwestern Poland that had been renamed Auschwitz by the Germans. His mission was to establish a concentration camp there, but when he arrived, he found only a series of abandoned buildings and a horse corral. The area was desolate and the climate was humid and unpleasant. However, Höss was determined to fulfill his task and make the camp work. As an SS officer, he was not allowed to question orders, only to carry them out. At the time, no one could have imagined the fate that awaited the city of Auschwitz. Höss was there to do his job, and he was going to do it efficiently. The city was about to become a key location for the Nazi regime, and Höss was the man in charge. Construction of the camp was progressing slowly, but Höss was determined to speed up the process. She knew that her work was important, and that the camp was going to be a key place in the Nazi regime's fight against its enemies. So he worked day and night, supervising the construction of the barracks and the installation of the barbed wire fences that would surround the camp. Meanwhile, the city of Auschwitz remained a quiet and peaceful place, unaware of what was brewing on the outskirts of the city. But soon, everything was going to change. The Auschwitz concentration camp was going to become a place of terror and death, and the city of Auschwitz was going to witness things that no one could have imagined. Rudolf Höss, the camp commandant, did not look like a cruel and ruthless man. In fact, he seemed like a completely normal person, like any other you might meet on the street. This is what American lawyer Whitney Harris thought when he questioned him during the Nuremberg trials. Inmates at Auschwitz also shared this impression, describing him as a calm and controlled person. But behind this harmless appearance, Höss had a past marked by violence and extremism. Born in the Black Forest in 1900, he grew up in a strict Catholic family, where his father always insisted on obedience. This prepared him for his future service in World War I, where he distinguished himself as one of the youngest non-commissioned officers in the German army. Germany's defeat in the war left him with a feeling of betrayal and disillusionment. He felt abandoned by the German government and military and began looking for more radical options. He joined the Freikorps paramilitary group, a far-right group that sought to counter communist influence on Germany's borders. But his involvement in violent actions landed him in prison. In 1923, he murdered his former teacher, Walter Kadow, because Kadow had denounced a fellow Freikorps member. Höss was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was released early in 1928. Despite his dark past, Höss always blamed an international Jewish conspiracy for his troubles. This mentality led him to join the SS and become one of the architects of the Holocaust. His story is a terrifying example of how a seemingly normal person can have a heart full of hate and a mind willing to commit atrocities. After his release from prison in 1928, Rudolf Höss decided to change course and joined a farming community. There he met his future wife and settled down as a farmer. However, his life took a dramatic turn in 1934 when Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's chief of police, invited him to join the SS as a full-time member. Höss had been a member of the Nazi Party since 1922 and had known Himmler for some time, so he accepted the invitation without hesitation. In November 1934, he arrived at Dachau in Bavaria to begin his service as a concentration camp guard. At that time, Concentration camps were places of temporary confinement and punishment, but they were not conceived as extermination camps. However, Höss would soon find himself at the center of the Nazi extermination machinery. Rudolf Höss's experience at Dachau was crucial to his training and career. The regime at Dachau was known for its brutality, and its goal was to break the will of its prisoners. There, Höss learned to channel the violence and hatred the Nazis felt toward their enemies into systems and order. Life in Dachau was hell, where prisoners were subjected to all kinds of abuse and torture. The guards were brutal and enjoyed inflicting pain and suffering on the prisoners. Physical violence was common, and prisoners could be murdered in cold blood by guards or other inmates. However, what really made Dachau such a terrifying place was not just the physical abuse, but the mental torture. The prisoners were subjected to a series of psychological games and manipulations that made them feel like they were losing their minds. The guards played mind games with the prisoners, making them believe they were about to be released, only to disappoint them and make them feel like they were doomed to spend the rest of their lives in the camp. Höss's experience at Dachau prepared him for his future role in the Nazi extermination machinery. Life in this camp was hell, but it was also a school for Höss, where he learned to become an instrument of death and destruction. In the camp, prisoners were subject to an extremely strict regime of discipline and control. They were required to keep their barracks and clothing in a state of absolute cleanliness and order, and any infraction, however minor, could be severely punished. Regular inspections by SS guards were a source of terror for prisoners, as any mistake or carelessness could be used as a pretext for punishment. Guards could even invent infractions to justify their punishments, which created a climate of fear and anxiety among prisoners. Furthermore, the capo system, which was introduced at Dachau and later spread to other concentration camps, allowed prisoners to monitor and control each other. A capo was a prisoner who was appointed by the camp authorities to supervise his fellow prisoners in a work block or command. The capo had enormous power over the other prisoners and was responsible for ensuring that work was done efficiently. However, this power also made him a target for other prisoners, who saw him as an instrument of Nazi oppression. If a capo failed to meet the expectations of the SS guards, he was replaced and returned to the general prisoner population, which often meant a death sentence. In 1936, Rudolf Höss was promoted to lieutenant and transferred to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he continued to work in camp management and hone his skills as a guard. Meanwhile, the situation in Europe was changing rapidly. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, triggering World War II. The Soviet Union also invaded Poland from the east, and the country was divided into two occupation zones. In this context, Höss was appointed commander of the new concentration camp at Auschwitz in the German occupation zone. Their task was to create a model concentration camp, which would serve as an example for other camps in Europe. Auschwitz was located in a strategic area near the city of Krakow in southern Poland. The camp was established on land that had previously been used as military barracks, and construction began in April 1940. Höss immediately got to work, supervising the construction of the camp and the arrival of the first prisoners. Their goal was to create a concentration camp that would be efficient and lethal, capable of handling thousands of prisoners and carrying out the Nazi regime's extermination policies. In the following months, Auschwitz became a place of terror and death, where prisoners were subjected to brutal conditions and forced to work in slave-like conditions. Höss became the main administrator of the camp, and his name became associated with the brutality and cruelty that took place there. The beginning of terror, Block 11. In June 1940, a group of 30 German prisoners arrived at Auschwitz with the mission of building the concentration camp from scratch. These men, who had been transferred from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, were faced with a monumental task: building a concentration camp without adequate tools or materials. The situation was desperate. Prisoners had to carry heavy stones and building materials without the aid of machinery, and if they did not work fast enough, they were beaten by SS guards. Despite the lack of resources, the SS insisted that the work be done as quickly as possible, regardless of the human cost. In their eagerness to meet the deadline, the Nazis resorted to a brutal solution: the looting of nearby houses. The prisoners were sent to demolish the homes of Polish families and were ordered to take the necessary building materials. Bricks, boards, wood and other materials were taken from the demolished houses and used to build the concentration camp. Meanwhile, the first Polish prisoners began arriving at Auschwitz, where they faced forced labor and mistreatment. The ethnic Germans who had arrived first became the first kapos, or prisoner leaders, and acted as intermediaries between the SS and the Polish prisoners. As the days passed, the Auschwitz concentration camp began to take shape. The prisoners worked day and night to build the barracks, barbed wire and watchtowers. The camp was becoming a place of confinement and torture, where prisoners were subjected to inhuman conditions and forced to work themselves to death. Auschwitz experienced a significant change. The visit of Oswald Pohl, head of the SS Main Administration and Economic Office, marked the beginning of a new era for the camp. Pohl ordered Höss to increase the camp's capacity, which meant that Auschwitz would become an even more important location for the Nazi regime. Himmler's idea was to create an autonomous economy for the Nazi state, and concentration camps like Auschwitz would be key to achieving this. The field would be used to provide raw materials, such as granite, for the construction of monumental buildings, such as Hitler's Reich Chancellery in Berlin. In this context, Block 11 was built, a building that became a place of terror and torture within the camp. Although from the outside it looked like just another red brick building, its purpose was somber and unique. Prisoners entering Block 11 were subjected to torture and murder, and methods such as hanging them from the ceiling beams or holding their heads in the heating stove were used to extract testimony. The existence of Block 11 was a reminder of the brutality and cruelty of the Nazi regime, and how concentration camps like Auschwitz were becoming instruments of terror and oppression. Prisoners who survived torture sessions in Block 11 returned to their barracks with physical and emotional injuries, and some lost their sight forever. In Block 11, SS Second Lieutenant Max Grabner exercised absolute control over the lives and deaths of the prisoners. With a background as a cowherd, Grabner had drastically changed his life by joining the SS, and now had the authority to decide who would live and who would die in his block. Born in 1905 in Vienna, Austria, Grabner grew up in a humble family and joined the SS in 1938. His rise to power was rapid, and he soon became one of the most feared men in Auschwitz. Each week, Grabner reviewed the prisoners' criminal records and made decisions about who would be punished or executed. Prisoners sentenced to death were taken to an isolated courtyard where they were brutally murdered. The yard was surrounded by a brick wall that prevented other prisoners from seeing what was happening there. Those sentenced to death were taken to the brick wall furthest from the entrance to the block, where an SS executioner shot them in the head with a small-caliber weapon. Grabner was a ruthless and unscrupulous man who enjoyed the power he had over prisoners. His decision of life or death was arbitrary, and prisoners who were sentenced to death by him were taken to their execution without any form of appeal. Block 11 was a place of terror and death, where prisoners were subjected to torture and executions. The presence of Grabner and his team of executioners made the block a place of fear and terror, where prisoners lived under the constant threat of being punished or executed. Surviving hard days. Within just 2 years, the situation at Auschwitz had become even more desperate. Of the 20,000 Poles who had initially been sent to the camp, more than half were no longer alive. This alarming mortality rate had turned Auschwitz into a place of terror and fear, where any prisoner of the Third Reich trembled at the sound of his name. Arriving at Auschwitz was a terrifying process. Prisoners were sent directly to the gas chambers or to a reception center near the entrance gate. There, they were subjected to an identification and classification process, which included having a prison number tattooed on their body. Soviet prisoners of war were the first to receive this treatment, and Auschwitz was the only concentration camp where prisoners were tattooed in this way. The tattooing process was painful and humiliating. Initially, tattoos were pierced into the chest with long needles, and the resulting wound was filled with ink. This allowed for quick and easy identification, especially when they were found dead in the field. Prisoners were also given a striped prison uniform and a colored triangle to sew onto the uniform. The color of the triangle indicated the prisoner's category, and Jews were identified by a yellow Star of David. Prisoner classification was strict and arbitrary. Criminals received purple or green triangles, depending on the severity of their crimes. Political prisoners wore a red triangle, while gypsies and homosexuals were identified with brown and pink triangles, respectively. Jehovah's Witnesses and so-called asocials wore black triangles. This classification was only the beginning of a process of humiliation and degradation that prisoners would suffer in Auschwitz. Once the prisoners had been identified and equipped with their uniforms, they were sent to their barracks, where the fight for survival began. Finding a bed was a daily challenge, as free beds were scarce and only available because their previous occupants had died. Most prisoners were forced to sleep on a pile of straw on the cold stone floor without any comfort or rest. Every evening, prisoners were required to report to the yard for roll call, a ritual that became a time of great tension and fear. It was at this moment that the fate of some of them was decided, and the uncertainty was palpable. Inside the camp, two groups of people were subjected to particularly cruel treatment: priests and Jews. These groups, along with Polish Catholic priests, were most likely to fall into the hands of the penal commando unit led by Ernst Krankemann, a capo notorious for his sadism. Krankemann had arrived at the camp in the second group of German criminals, transferred from Sachsenhausen in August 1940. Although despised by many in the SS, Krankemann enjoyed the support of two powerful partisans: Karl Fritsch, Huss's deputy, and Gerhard Palitsch, the commander's chief assistant. However, Palitsch was not exempt from corruption, and in 1944 he was imprisoned for stealing personal items from inmates and sexually assaulting a Jewish prisoner, a crime considered racial contamination in the Third Reich. Corruption and brutality were endemic in the camp, and prisoners lived in a state of constant fear and terror. Krankemann, a capo at the concentration camp, was known for his cruelty and his impressive size. He routinely sat on the harness of a giant roller that was used to flatten the roll call square in the center of the field. Because the roller was very heavy, it took about 20 people to pull it, and Krankemann made sure they did it as quickly as possible. With a whip in his hand, Krankemann would beat prisoners who could not keep up, forcing them to work harder. One night, one of the prisoners collapsed to his knees and was unable to get up to continue pulling the roller. At that point, Krankemann ordered the rest of the penal command to pull the giant roller over his prone companion. The SS encouraged this type of brutality and rewarded Krankemann and other capos with treats such as an extra portion of soup, which was a luxury in the camp, or a larger piece of bread than was given to ordinary prisoners. They also received cigarettes, which were a valuable commodity in the countryside and could be used to buy favors or protection. Some capos were even given better clothing and shoes than ordinary prisoners, which gave them an appearance of authority and power. These rewards were an incentive for capos like Krankemann to continue their brutality and maintain control over prisoners. The IG Farben crime, the production of Zyklon B. During the course of the war, SS leaders and capos were not the only ones responsible for the brutality that was unleashed in the camps. Behind the scenes, there were businessmen and executives who also played an important role in the machinery of oppression. In May 1941, Dr. Otto Ambros, a senior executive at the chemical company IG Farben, began searching for a suitable location to build a synthetic rubber factory in the east. The war had taken an unexpected turn, and the Nazis' original plans to transport Jews to Africa after the war no longer seemed viable. Until recently, Himmler had planned to deport all Jews to Africa once the war ended, which was expected to be in a matter of months. But the reality was different. The war was dragging on, and the Nazis realized they needed to find ways to produce essential materials, such as rubber and fuel, within the Reich. IG Farben had assumed that after the war they would be able to obtain raw materials from the newly conquered colonies. But with the war far from over, German planners had to adapt to the new reality. Churchill's refusal to surrender and the Royal Air Force's victory in the Battle of Britain had changed the course of the war. The Nazis, known for their ambition and optimism, were forced to react to the unexpected. Their lack of planning and foresight, combined with the strength of their enemies, led them to face problems they had not anticipated. The war was becoming a much greater challenge than they had imagined, and entrepreneurs like Dr. Ambros had to find ways to contribute to the war effort. The chemical company IG Farben began to rethink its expansion plans, which had been put on hold due to expectations of a quick end to the war. Although not a state-owned enterprise, IG Farben had close ties to the Nazi leadership and was willing to assist in its plans. The Nazi 4-year plan had called for the construction of a synthetic rubber plant, known as Buna in the east. After a long discussion, IG Farben decided to build the plant in Silesia, a region that included the area where the Auschwitz camp was located. The production of synthetic rubber required coal, which was subjected to a high-temperature hydrogenation process. However, in order for the plant to operate, it was necessary to have access to essential raw materials such as lime, water, and above all, coal. In addition, IG Farben required that the chosen site have a developed transport and housing infrastructure. Otto Ambros, an IG Farben executive, had been studying maps and plans in search of a suitable site for the new Buna plant. Ultimately, he believed he had found the perfect location, about 5 kilometers east of the Auschwitz camp. However, the proximity of the concentration camp was not initially a determining factor in the decision to locate the factory in the area. At the time, IG Farben was more interested in hiring incoming ethnic Germans as workers than in relying exclusively on slave labor. But most able-bodied German workers were being sent to the battlefields, and few were available to work in the factories. It was then that Otto Ambros began to consider the possibility of using the free labor that was available at the Auschwitz camp. The IG Farben company had been looking for an opportunity to expand and increase its production of synthetic rubber. After considering several sites, they decided to establish a plant in the Auschwitz area of Poland. This completely changed the history of the camp, as it went from a relatively small place of detention to a major center for the production of materials essential to the German war effort. Himmler visited Auschwitz and announced that the camp would be expanded to house 30,000 inmates instead of the original 10,000. However, Höss, the camp commander, expressed concerns about the lack of materials and resources to carry out the expansion. Himmler responded by offering a deal. If IG Farben helped build barracks and provide materials, Auschwitz could provide workers for the plant. But IG Farben's involvement in Auschwitz was much deeper than initially thought. The company not only provided materials and helped build barracks, but also produced a lethal gas called Zyklon B. This gas was used in several concentration camps, including Auschwitz, to kill large groups of prisoners in a matter of minutes. Between 1942 and 1945, Zyklon B was responsible for the deaths of more than 1 million people in Europe. After the war, IG Farben executives faced consequences for their involvement in the production of Zyklon B and their role in the German war effort. In 1947, the US government imprisoned 9 of the company's directors, including Otto Ambros, for war crimes. The IG Farben company was dismantled, and its assets were divided up among several German companies. The tragedy of the 20th century. The final solution, a plan to eradicate Jews from Europe, began to take shape in the minds of Nazi leaders, including Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler. Earlier in 1940, Himmler had suggested deporting the Jews to a remote location within the Third Reich, such as the African island of Madagascar. However, the war against the Soviet Union, which had begun in June 1941, altered the course of events. The adverse reaction to the war led the Nazis to seek a more drastic solution to the Jewish problem. The elimination of Soviet Jews by shooting men, women and children became official policy. The Jews of Western Europe and the German Reich remained relatively intact at first, but the idea of transporting Jews to Africa was soon discarded. Instead, Hitler ordered Reinhard Heydrich to draw up a plan to deport the Jews to somewhere under German control. The war with the Soviet Union was expected to last only a few weeks, so Heydrich and Hitler thought it reasonable to plan for the Jews to be relocated further east that fall. Despite this, the war dragged on, and the final solution became a policy of mass extermination. The decision to eliminate women and children in the east was seen as a necessary measure to solve a specific problem. However, this measure would have unexpected consequences and lead to the development of new methods of assassination. A significant challenge facing SS officers was the emotional difficulty of shooting women and children at point-blank range. Himmler, aware of this problem, ordered a method of murder to be found that would minimize the psychological impact on his men. In an attempt to improve the killing process, the Nazis experimented with different methods, including exploding victims. But even so, they soon realized that this method was not viable. The adult euthanasia program had successfully used bottled carbon monoxide as a method of killing, but transporting large quantities of these cylinders over long distances was impractical. It was then that Rudolf Höss learned of the existence of a gas called Zyklon B, which was used to kill insects in the area around Auschwitz. Höss reasoned that if this gas was effective in killing lice, it could be used to kill humans. Block 11, an execution site within the camp, seemed the ideal location to conduct an experiment with this gas. With the IG Farben production plant being built just 5 kilometers from Auschwitz, Höss knew he could obtain all the gas he needed within a very short time. Thus he set out to carry out Hitler's orders and carry out the experiment with Zyklon B. This gas would become a key instrument in the implementation of the final solution, a plan that would have devastating consequences for millions of people. The hell of the gas chambers. The Nazis had been experimenting with different methods to eliminate those they considered undesirable. Before Zyklon B became the preferred method, chemical injections had been used to kill the disabled. However, a more efficient method was soon switched to: bottled carbon monoxide. Special gas chambers, disguised as shower rooms, were built in extermination centers located in former psychiatric hospitals. Between October 1939 and May 1940, around 10,000 psychiatric patients were murdered in West Prussia and the Watergau. Many of them died in a mobile gas chamber, a converted van with a hermetically sealed compartment in the back. Victims were pushed into this compartment and then suffocated with bottled carbon monoxide. After families were murdered, the Nazis handed over their homes to arriving ethnic Germans as part of an effort to repopulate the area with the superior race. This process of ethnic cleansing and extermination was carried out in a systematic and calculated manner, with the aim of creating a pure territory for the German people. The use of gas chambers and other methods of extermination became an integral part of Nazi policy, aimed at eliminating those they considered a threat to their ideology and their vision of a German future. The story of these events is a grim reminder of the horrors that can occur when ideology and hatred combine with power and a lack of compassion. In 1941, the euthanasia campaign was extended to concentration camps, including Auschwitz, as part of a plan known as Action 14F13. On July 28th, it was announced during the evening roll call that sick inmates could receive medical care in a hospital. Some prisoners were relieved to finally receive help, but others were wary of the offer. A group of about 500 sick inmates, some of whom had volunteered, was taken from the camp and taken to a waiting train. Instead of receiving medical attention, however, they were transported to a converted psychiatric hospital in Sonnenstein near Danzig, where they were murdered in a gas chamber. This was the first case of Auschwitz prisoners being gassed, but it did not occur inside the camp. Instead, they were transported to Germany to be murdered. The reason for their murder was not that they were Jewish, but that they were no longer able to work. This method of transporting prisoners long distances to be killed was soon deemed inefficient. SS officers at Auschwitz began building hermetically sealed rooms that resembled showers within the camp. The use of Zyklon B simplified the killing process, as it did not require guards to look into their victims' eyes while killing them. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, was pleased with this method of murder, as he believed it was better for the morale of his SS team. The introduction of Zyklon B ushered in a new era of efficiency and brutality at the Auschwitz concentration camp. In 1941, a plan called Action 14F13 was put into effect, which involved identifying prisoners who were no longer capable of working and sending them to a place where they would be eliminated. On July 28th of that year, a selection was carried out at Auschwitz. Prisoners who were sick or disabled were separated from the rest and taken to a waiting train. They were told they would be taken to a hospital for medical attention, but in fact they were going to be sent to a gas chamber. These prisoners were transported to a psychiatric hospital in Sonnenstein near Danzig, where they were subjected to a gassing process. It was the first case of Auschwitz prisoners being subjected to this process, although it did not occur inside the camp. The Nazis later decided that it was more practical to build disposal facilities inside the concentration camp. This meant that prisoners would not have to be transported long distances to carry out the process. Special rooms were built that resembled shower rooms, and a gas called Zyklon B was used for elimination. The use of Zyklon B simplified the process as it did not require guards to directly confront the victims. The commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, considered this method to be more suitable for the morale of his team. In March 1942, the first gas chamber at Auschwitz-Birkenau began operating. A group of Polish Jews, sent by the Gestapo from Silesia, were taken directly from the Auschwitz loading station to the Birkenau gas chamber and then buried in a nearby meadow. The gas chamber was located in a brick hut known as the Little Red House, or Bunker 1, which had been converted into a gasification facility. The Little Red House was a brick cottage that had been modified to suit its new purpose. The windows had been boarded up and its 4 rooms converted into 2 separate rooms. On the doors of each room were signs reading "Disinfection," suggesting that the Nazis were attempting to maintain the illusion that the gas chamber was a place of disinfection rather than a place of murder. In June 1942, a second brick hut, known as Bunker 2 or Little White House, was converted and put into operation. When Heinrich Himmler visited the camp in July 1942, he was shown a selection of Dutch Jews who were murdered in the gas chamber of Bunker 2. Himmler was greatly impressed by this method of murder, as well as by the construction site of Auschwitz III, the new IG Farben plant that was being built nearby. The use of Bunkers 1 and 2 was stopped in the spring of 1943, when new crematoria with a larger capacity were built. However, Bunker 2 was put into operation again in May 1944 for the murder of Hungarian Jews. Bunker 1 was demolished in 1943 and Bunker 2 in November 1944. The large crematorium at Auschwitz-Birkenau was built in October 1941, together with a new prisoner of war camp at Birkenau. The crematorium was designed with a sophisticated ventilation system that expelled old air and introduced fresh air, suggesting that it was designed to function as a gas chamber in addition to its original function of cremating the bodies of those who died in the camp. In January 1945, just as the Soviet Red Army was about to arrive at the camp, the Nazis used dynamite to blow up the crematoria and cottages in an effort to keep their crimes hidden from the rest of the world. This act of destruction was a desperate attempt to erase evidence of the horrors that had occurred at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Angel of Death, the story of Josef Mengele in Auschwitz. One name stands out for its cruelty and sadism: Dr. Josef Mengele. He arrived at the camp at a crucial time when the Birkenau crematoria were being completed and the camp was about to enter its most destructive period. Mengele specialized in experiments on living human subjects and had a particular interest in children. He brought them chocolate and gained their trust, but in reality, he only saw them as objects of study. He was obsessed with the study of twins, and when he received news that twins had arrived in the camp, he asked that no one touch them except him. Mengele's experiments were brutal and senseless. He would kill one of the twins and then perform comparative autopsies. He also experimented on dwarves and people with diseases such as Noma. Most of his test subjects died during the experiments or were left disfigured. Before Auschwitz, Mengele was a war hero and a respected doctor, but in the camp he became a monster. After the war, he escaped to Brazil, where he continued his genetic experiments in secret. He died in 1979 without having been tried for his crimes. Mengele's legacy is one of horror and sadism. His name has become synonymous with Auschwitz and human cruelty. On January 27th, Red Army soldiers arrived at the Auschwitz complex and found some 7,000 prisoners alive, most of them in deplorable conditions. The prisoners who remained in the camps were those in the worst condition, while the other 65,000 prisoners whom the Germans considered fit were taken from the camps and forced to march west on foot. The Death March, as it became known, was one of the most terrifying experiences the prisoners endured. It was worse than the constant selections, worse than the starvation diet in the camps, worse than the disease-infested and frost-ridden huts in which they lived. Prisoners were dragged out of the camp, dressed in thin prison clothes that offered totally inadequate protection against the snow and freezing wind of a Polish winter. Russian soldiers arriving at Auschwitz were shocked by the Nazis' treatment of prisoners. Soviet soldiers described what they found in the filthy barracks as living skeletons. They were even afraid to touch them, thinking they might kill them by mistake. The liberating forces, assisted by the Polish Red Cross, attempted to help the survivors by organizing medical care and food. Red Army hospitals treated 4,500 survivors, and photographs and films were taken to document the camp. However, most survivors were too weak to be transported and had to be treated on site. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of prisoners were marched towards Dachau and Loslau in the worst conditions imaginable. The death march was one of the most terrifying experiences the prisoners endured. Temperatures of -20 degrees Celsius were recorded, and some Upper Silesian residents tried to help the prisoners on the march. However, many of those who tried to escape were shot in the back. The date of the liberation of Auschwitz is recognized by the United Nations and the European Union as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Memorials are held each year on January 27th to remember and honor the victims of the Holocaust. Conclusion. This account shows the atrocity and horror of the Holocaust, where millions of people, including Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and others, were subjected to inhumane conditions and murdered en masse. The efficiency and brutality of the Nazis in implementing the final solution are evident in the construction of gas chambers and the use of Zyklon B. The story of Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death, is an example of the cruelty and sadism that prevailed in the camp. The liberation of Auschwitz on 27 January 1945 by the Soviet Red Army put an end to the suffering of the prisoners, but the memory of the victims must be remembered and honored. The commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day is an important reminder of the importance of promoting tolerance, understanding, and peace to prevent similar atrocities from happening again in the future. The history of Auschwitz is a call to humanity to never forget and always remember the consequences of hatred and intolerance.